Okay, let's go. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely and drafty in here, so I hope you'll all be comfortable. But if anyone nods off, as ever, I won't be offended. I'll just be really glad that you're relaxing. So, as Spencer said, this is a big one. It's the biggest exhibition that we've done since reopening in 2011. But it's not been that difficult because putting together the exhibition and a lot of the admin work as well have been done by our colleagues at Compton Verney. So I thought it might be useful to start with a bit of background about Compton Verney. Here it is. I'm sure a lot of you have already been there. It's a really interesting institution. Like the Holburne, it's independent. So it's a Georgian house. It belonged to the Verney or Willoughby family and was remodelled by Robert Adam in the middle of the 18th century, landscaped by Capability Brown, new little extension-y bits by Stanton Williams. And what they've done is they've created a link between the service wing and the original house, and exhibition spaces and shop and so on. Not unlike what we've done here, but rather earlier in the early, sort of about 10 years before our project. But we have had an informal partnership with Compton Verney since about 2004. They describe themselves as the award-winning gallery in Warwickshire. And they have, like the Holburne, a very busy programme of exhibitions and events. Two big differences. One is in their collection. Their collection has been formed over a very short period by Peter Moores, and he formed a collection of things that weren't seen that much in other museums in the area. So he's concentrated on some very specific areas: German Renaissance works, 18th century Neapolitan things. There's the wonderful folk art collection, Chinese bronzes, and also a British 18th century collection. And not long ago, again in the early noughties, they bought a pair of Canalettos, which are actually in this exhibition. So that's the starting point for the exhibition. So this is the first time, in spite of us working with Compton Verney for such a long time, this is the first time that one of their exhibitions has ever come to us. We've sent an exhibition, Gainsborough's Landscapes, we sent that to Compton Verney. This time they're sending their exhibition to us. This is the man behind the exhibition, so if you don't like it, you know who to complain to. He will be here tomorrow evening for the private view. Stephen Parisian, who is the current director at Compton Verney. He is primarily or originally an architectural historian. So he is looking at Canaletto very much through the eyes of somebody with an interest in British architecture and the history of Britain. So hence why the exhibition is called Canaletto Celebrating Britain, and the emphasis is very much on the celebrating Britain, as you'll see. This is what it looked like at Compton Verney. Very different from how it looks here. They're all exactly the same objects, with the exception of two drawings which were in the show at Compton Verney, but which we won't be borrowing here. But everything else is all exactly the same stuff. So that's how it looked at Compton Verney, as you can see, curated by Dr. Stephen Parisian, exhibited at Compton Verney. Holburne Museum, I don't know where of art came from. We're not called that anymore. And then it's going on to Abbott Hall in Kendal for the winter. So it's quite a long tour that the exhibition is going to have. There's also a book, and I'm not calling it a catalogue, this is very much a book. So what's in the book doesn't necessarily relate 100% to what's in the exhibition. For example, there aren't photographs of all of the works in the exhibition, and there are also illustrations of objects which aren't in the exhibition. So please be careful with that. Don't assume it's a catalogue and that everything you see in the gallery is in this book. The book is very much a book of essays around the subject of celebrating Britain. As you can see from the title, Canaletto, Hogarth and Patriotism. So they're looking at a much broader subject. We don't, for instance, have any works by Hogarth in the exhibition. The exhibition is much more about the Canaletto bit and the patriotism bit, but not the Hogarth bit. So if you have a chance to read the book, I hope that will begin to make sense, and you'll get an understanding of how the exhibition and the book relate to each other. But it's a really nice book. It's published by Paul Holburne, who's a very high-profile specialist art book publisher, and we hope it will do well. Also, a lot of the people who've written essays for the book will be coming and doing talks here, so keep an eye on the what's on. This is our advertisement for the exhibition. I'll start by explaining what it's about. So, obviously, Canaletto is a very popular artist. He's a very prolific artist. So there have been lots of Canaletto exhibitions in the recent past, most recently just down the road at the Victoria Art Gallery, not just closing now. But Canaletto, he's so prolific that there's plenty to go around. The most similar exhibition to happen recently was one called Canaletto in England, which started off at the Yale Centre for British Art in America, and then went on to the Dulwich Picture Gallery. That was nearly 10 years ago, 2006 to 2007. It was a much bigger exhibition. It had one or two of the same things in it, but that was very much looking at Canaletto in the context of the art world. It was about his time in England, but his patrons in London, what he painted for whom. So it was quite a connoisseur's exhibition, whereas in our exhibition the emphasis is very much on architecture and on this idea of British patriotism. It's about, it's a very exciting time in London in the 1750s when Canaletto came here. It's when Britain is really forging an identity for itself as a nation. Great Britain as a nation had only existed for 40 years when Canaletto arrived here. 1707, England and Wales and Scotland were united, so the idea of Britain first emerges as an actual nation and as a European power. And Canaletto's patrons came from a political circle which was very excited about Britain's success, not only its victories in recent wars, victories in particular against the French, but also Britain's prosperity. It was a time when Britain was really beginning to come to the fore as a major, not only a major European nation, but as a major world power. And in order to do that, a nation has to have its own cultural identity. And as you know, before the 18th century, culture in Britain was very often dominated by foreigners, foreign artists from the Low Countries, from Italy, foreign musicians, always copying the other European nations, always coming after them. Whereas in the 18th century, Britain starts to stand alone, not just culturally, but also economically. And you'll see a lot of evidence of the economic power of Britain in these paintings. Another strand in the exhibition is the effect that the Italian painter Canaletto had on British painters working in London around the same time as him. So, although I've just said that the British were creating their own cultural identity, it was still very much based on continental models, and at this time, in the middle of the 18th century, you couldn't really succeed as an artist unless you'd been abroad, and there were very few who managed to be really successful without having had a grand tour, one of whom was Thomas Gainsborough. But we're not talking about Gainsborough today, we're talking about, like, the view of London in the background here. But that view of London has been copied direct from Canaletto's own views. That's a detail from the Royal Collection's drawing of the view from Somerset House. So, just a little bit of biographical background about Canaletto. His proper name was Giovanni Antonio Canal. Canal is a very Venetian name, of course. It's full of canals, and the Venetians often miss off the ends of words. They don't really do consonants that much, so Venetian surnames will often end in a consonant. So Canal rather than Canale is very Venetian. But he came to be known as Canaletto, partly because he was working with his father. So you've got Big Canal and Little Canal. He helped his father. His father was a scene painter, and he started doing that in about 1716. He was born in 1697, so when he was about 20. And they didn't just work in Venice. In Venice, they made scenery for several theatres, often for operas. Opera was a huge thing in Venice, particularly at Carnival time. So he worked for impresarios putting on operas by Vivaldi, for example. But they also worked in Rome. In Rome, they did shows with music by Scarlatti, so that gives you a sense of the sort of circles that he was working in. While he was back home in Venice working as an independent artist, he came under the patronage of a really, really important character in the art world of the 18th century, Joseph Smith, also known as Consul Smith. Smith was a great collector. He lived in Venice, and he lived in a palazzo where grand tourists, British grand tourists, would go. They would look at his collection, but they'd also go to meet socially. And they would also go to see Smith because he acted as a dealer as well as a collector. So if you're in Venice wanting to buy stuff, he would find it for you. So he's a really, really useful contact for Canaletto. He sold a lot of his work. A very high percentage of his work was sold to British clients who were passing through Venice and wanted a souvenir. Smith is also interesting because quite late in life he sold most of his collection to George III. So now many of the very beautiful things that he owned are in the Royal Collection, which is jolly useful to us because they're generous lenders, and so we've got lots of lovely things from the Royal Collection in the exhibition. We're very grateful to them, and of course to all the other lenders. This one's from the National Trust, by the way. So, as I said, this isn't by Canaletto. It's painted about 30 years after he died. And here is an early work. So this is now looking at what's in the exhibition. And we've got 3 paintings of Venice. You can't really have a Canaletto show and not have some pictures of Venice. So we've got some of these. This is an early one from the late 1720s. So he's still quite young, but working independently of his father. And it's so typical of what you expect of his work. You've got wonderful sky, water, reflections in the water, the buildings, very much a painter of architecture. And then the people. And the people, of course, have been added with great care to give a sense of life, a sense of movement. But he also uses a clever trick with his people that they're very often pointing. They might be gesturing to each other. But the gestures that they make also point out to you, the viewer, the things that you ought to look at. So this character pointing over here, look at that. And then he uses masts and oars and all these different sticks and poles to point your eye in different directions. And I won't spend too much time looking at that with you now, because you can see it for yourself in the paintings upstairs. So where are we? This is San Giorgio Maggiore, which is a very ancient monastery, but it was remodelled by Andrea Palladio. It was one of his first big jobs in Venice, and he worked on it on and off throughout the 1560s. Very typical of his work, with this beautiful white marble facade on brick building. Very symmetrical. You get the 4 columns here, very much made in a classical style. I should also point out this is the Dogana, which is the customs house, a particularly beautiful customs house. It's a late 17th century building, and on top the statue of Fortune, and she spins around. It's a weathercock, so it spins around and it shows you the direction of the wind. And she's holding a gilded sail which catches the sunlight, so it's very easy to see which way the wind is blowing. And the ball as well, that's golden, so it's a very beautiful building which catches the sunlight. That's another thing that Canaletto is very clever with. He uses the light to pick out the things that he wants you to look at. So here, that's the brightest thing in the picture. That's the thing that the sun is shining on. And also this sail here as well. Whereas the Dogana building, that's not important. That's not what he wants you to look at. This is a much later version of a very similar view, 1740, a much maturer Canaletto. The reflection here is much more obvious, and I like the contrast between this very calm water here and all the busyness that's going on here. You see the mess of all these sails and spars and pokey things sticking up all over the place, and also the quite messy riva here with all these very messy buildings, which are quite sort of haphazard. So you've got the sort of calm white monastery and the busy, busy city, and that's something you'll see a lot in his pictures of London. This is a different church. It's a later work of Palladio's. It's similar marble facade with 4 columns. It's the Church of the Holy Redeemer, the Redentore, a view that he made many, many different versions of. So I haven't said anything yet about Palladio and his sort of background. He's basing a lot of what he does on ancient Roman textbooks. So he's not just looking at ancient buildings and using them as a model, but he's also using ancient theory and reviving it to create a very pure classical style. And that's what the British loved about his work. That symmetry, the elegance. The buildings are very grand, they're very imposing, but they're not pompous like later Baroque buildings. This is a drawing from the Royal Collection of a similar image. It's not exactly the same. We've got several drawings in the exhibition paired with related paintings, and I hope they give you an idea of the process where he revisits the same subject again and again. Some of the drawings are sketches or studies, and many of the drawings are actually finished drawings whose purpose is that they're a finished product that he has made for sale. So he will very often do the same drawing or a similar drawing many times over to sell to many different clients. And so we come to Britain. So as I said, by the 1730s, Canaletto was painting a lot of his work and drawing a lot of his work for direct export to Britain through Joseph Smith. So he wasn't even selling it to British people while they were in Venice. He was actually just sending it straight abroad through Smith, who would take the orders from his friends and associates back home in England. And then in 1741, yet another war breaks out, the War of the Austrian Succession. It lasted 7 years, and it was a huge war. It spread to America. Almost the beginnings of the idea of a world war that covers several different continents. He can't send work abroad anymore. You just can't export things like that while there's a war on. And the tourists can't come to him. So eventually, by 1747, although the war, unbeknown to him, was nearly over by then, he came to London. He followed the business back to London. Now, this view of Greenwich, this is a funny one, because it probably wasn't made here in England. It was probably made before he came here. And there are lots of clues to that. One clue is that there is no evidence that this picture was ever in Britain until 1871. So it's a view of the Naval Hospital, now known as the Royal Naval College in Greenwich. It's a very well-known view of London, of this amazing complex designed by Christopher Wren. This is Wren's largest, in fact, anyone at the time, it's the largest building in London that wasn't a church. So it's bigger than any of the palaces, the largest single building. Built in the Baroque style by Sir Christopher Wren. And then here, this is the Queen's House, which was built much earlier, 1616, by Inigo Jones. And Inigo Jones is a really important figure because he is the one who brings Palladio's designs from Venice. Palladio wrote 4 books of architecture with diagrams and everything. And Inigo Jones comes back from Italy with those books tucked under his arm and introduces the Palladian style to Britain. He builds the Queen's House in 1616, but the style doesn't really take off in a serious way until after Sir Christopher Wren has died. So it doesn't really take off till the 1720s, 1730s. It takes another 100 years before British patrons kind of get it. Anyway, going back to this picture of Greenwich, spot the mistakes. You have to know the area quite well to do this, but I'll point out one really obvious mistake. There are several Union Jacks, and they're wrong. They're really wrong. Can you see that one? Red background, and then there's a white cross there, and a white cross there, and a blue cross on top. He's got it all back to front and upside down. And the reason for that must be because he copied this view from a print, a black and white engraving. He didn't know what the colours were supposed to be. And the Union Jack is the most obvious mistake, but there are other topographical errors as well for people who are very familiar with Greenwich. But it's a picture that tells us a lot about Britain, and in particular London, at the time when Canaletto arrived here, that it's really beginning to throw its weight about as a naval power. It's also beginning to be a very important economic power, and that London is a city which relies very heavily on its river. It's a port, more than anything else, as well as a political capital. And it's also a place where you can go and have fun in a very equal sort of way. So the pleasure gardens are something that is fairly uniquely British at the time. Vauxhall Gardens was somewhere where anybody could go, provided they could pay their admission ticket and provided they were properly dressed. And although it had been originally established in 1661, it was remodelled in the 1730s to 40s with the latest of everything, and the owners kept, just as in Sydney Gardens, the owners kept renewing the attractions that were there. So here is Vauxhall in its heyday, about 1750. And I'll just point out some of the details. This is the orchestra, lovely octagonal building, and there's the orchestra making lovely noises, presumably, one imagines. This is the organ house. So there's the organ in the middle, and then more musicians there. This is the Grand Walk, various other walks, statue of Aurora at the end. This funny-looking sort of pumpkin building here, that's the Turkish tent, so it's a bit of exoticness added to the gardens. And then this bit here, that's the bit that's important for us, because those are the supper boxes. Those are the original supper boxes, which were then imitated at Sydney Gardens, and which inspired our present cafe. These views of the pleasure gardens by Canaletto, these become the definitive views. They become like the postcards. They are reproduced by many different printmakers. And there are, I don't know how many copies of these prints that were pirated well into the 19th century. So when people imagine what Vauxhall, what Ranelagh looked like in the 18th century, they're always seeing it through Canaletto's eyes. Ranelagh was a bit smarter. It was more expensive to get into. It was adjacent to Chelsea Hospital. It's completely disappeared now. And it had this wonderful building. It looks really beautiful. It's built of wood. So it's a kind of a really smart, huge marquee or giant circus tent. It's a bit like, you know, that Spiegel tent that they have sometimes on the wreck. I imagine it's like a really posh version of that. Again, with supper boxes. You can sit in these little boxes and have your tea. And tea was included. You got tea and bread and butter included in your admission ticket here. This is a stove. So everyone's standing around here keeping warm. That means you can come here in the winter as well. There's an organ here and an orchestra. And do look at this properly upstairs. I know you can't really see it that well here. There is so much going on, so many people doing different things. There are also lots of children. And those children remind us that about 10 years after this was painted, a very famous child came to perform on this organ, one Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Walton Bridge. Canaletto was employed above all to depict the wonders of British engineering, and this is a real wonder. Walton-on-Thames is about 25 miles outside of London, kind of in the Staines, Hampton Court sort of area. What an amazing bridge. It was built on stone piers, but this is all made of wooden slats. It was engineered by William Etheridge, who also created the mathematical bridge at Queen's College in Cambridge. And you can safely drive a coach and six over it. There's the coach and six, driving over this amazing wooden structure. The man who initiated this project and who financed it and collected the tolls lived in this house, a man called Samuel Dicker. But that's not him in the foreground. It's quite odd how this group can have appeared, because as far as we can tell, they've got nothing to do with Walton. This man here, in the yellow coat, rather huge man, is Thomas Hollis, who owned the picture. And we think he may just have chosen the picture because he liked the subject. So there's Thomas Hollis, there's Thomas Brand, who was his friend, and a Roman antiquary called Francesco, and there is Hollis's dog, who was called Malta, and the man on the stool here, as far as we can see, it's Canaletto himself. And there's also a milkmaid, very Dutch-looking milkmaid here, driving her cow down to the water. Right, this is the highlight of the show, these wonderful views from Somerset House. do you all know? Have you all been to Somerset House? You know where it is. It's where the Courtauld galleries are, and they've done a lot of work recently. So now you can walk through and you can walk onto the terrace and look onto the river like these people here. It's a very good vantage point because it's more or less equidistant between St Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey, so you can look either way towards both. It had been a royal palace, but by the time this was painted, it was just broken up into various state apartments for sort of state employees, and the garden was somewhere where you could just walk around. There are many versions of this. This particular one is from the Royal Collection, so this is one that Canaletto sold to Joseph Smith. So I'll just run through what's what, but again, it's better to look at the real thing. So the earliest thing that you can see distinctly is these steps. These were actually created by Inigo Jones as part of the project working for the Queen Henrietta Maria. So this would have been 1620s, 1630s, developing the palace. River steps are a really important part of London life because they're where you go to hail a taxi, to get a waterman to come and take you wherever you want to go. And that's what seems to be happening here. This man seems to be having some difficulty communicating with the people in this boat here, and he's standing up very dangerously. So we think there's some kind of a joke going on there. If anybody can work out what's going on, please do let me know. I'm sure somebody must have worked it out. So, St Paul's Cathedral completely dominates the landscape, as it did in those days. Not anymore. This is the post-fire city of London. So 1666, the entire city is basically completely flattened. And Christopher Wren comes in and rebuilds the lot in the space of about 40, 50 years. An extraordinary achievement. And here are all the spires of many of the churches that he built, one after another. Someone's actually counted these, and they've worked out there are nearly 40 spires visible in this picture. You've also got the monument, which was erected after the fire, and then the funny thing here, there's this sort of wooden tower, which seems to be a water tower. And in the far distance here, you've got the old London Bridge. That was the one with the houses on. And they used to stick traitors' heads on poles at the gate, but not by the 18th century. They're a bit more civilised by this time. And lots of things going on with the boats and with the people. And as I said before, all sorts of poles and sticks that point your eye. So this one in particular is sending you over here to the Dome of St Paul's. Another one here sending you over there. This is a drawing, also in the Royal Collection, closely related but more realistic. It's a much more realistic view of what you would have seen. You can see how the river steps are actually much closer to your eye, and this doesn't curve away quite so dramatically. The companion view looks towards Westminster. So here is Westminster Abbey, which again in those days dominated the landscape. There is St Margaret's Church sort of lurking in the shadows, St Stephen's Hall, Westminster Palace, and the Westminster Bridge, which was brand new. I'll tell you more about that later. We've got some very nice barges here, some sort of smart barges belonging to important people. We don't know who. This is the banqueting house. Inigo Jones again, working about 1630, creating a banqueting house for Whitehall Palace. This thing here, that is definitely not Cleopatra's Needle. That, again, is a water tower, and you will see that water tower again and again and again. It always gets in the way. I'm not sure how many times it appears in the whole exhibition, but there it is. Lots of people walking around having fun. There are some ducks here. That's my favourite bit. There's some ducks by the pond. And there's a man here who, I don't know if he's feeding the ducks or stealing them or quite what. But again, if anybody can work it out, do let me know. And the companion drawing that shows you perhaps a more realistic view of what you would have seen. So Canaletto always takes reality and tidies it up a bit to make a nicer picture. We also look in this exhibition at the development of part of Whitehall Palace, the old Horse Guards building. This is a really lovely picture. This photograph doesn't do it justice at all. It comes from the collection of Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber, who's lent it to the Tate Gallery, who have lent it to us, so we're very lucky to have it. Canaletto has been clever here because the Horse Guards building itself, this is an old 17th century building. It's the army headquarters. It's about to be knocked down. And he doesn't let you see that because he's covered it in shadow. Instead, he lets the light fall on this much newer building. This is the Admiralty building, where the Navy have their headquarters. So in a way, what he's saying is the Navy is more important than the Army. Other detail, this is the end of Downing Street. Lots of things going on. There's a servant looking out of the window there. There are some people beating a carpet. This seems to be the house of the person who paid for the painting. I'll point this out to you upstairs, but there are some men here standing against the wall, doing things that only people in old pictures can do. And lots of other people wandering around. This is supposed to be a really elegant part of London, and there are elegant people wandering around. But I do wonder if there's a joke there, the fact that these people here, standing by the end of Downing Street, maybe that's just me. This is a design for the new Horse Guards building. This is the apotheosis of the Palladian style. It is perfectly symmetrical. A very typical feature of Palladianism is the way that the building has very strong horizontal bands, division into layers, almost like a layer cake. And these windows, these Venetian, so-called Venetian windows, because they were introduced by Palladio from ancient models. This is a beautiful drawing. This is a terrible photograph, but it's a beautiful drawing from a very important book called Vitruvius Britannicus, which is a kind of handbook of Palladian architecture. I should explain about Vitruvius. He is actually the model for Palladio. He is the only ancient architect whose writings we have. He wrote down how you build buildings, what the dimensions should be, what the proportions should be. He lived in the time of the Emperor Augustus, so about the year 0. And he wrote this book called De Architectura, which is what Palladio based his designs on. So Vitruvius Britannicus is the British Vitruvius. It's British artists responding to Vitruvius through Palladio. And it was a book published in several volumes of the best designs by the great Palladian architects. And this design is by probably the #1 Palladian architect of the 18th century, William Kent. So when you see the Horse Guards building at the back of St James's Park, remember William Kent. I hope that all makes sense. And here it is. Here's the new building, nearly finished. It's just the tower here is being completed. Do you see how Canaletto's lit it up this time? This is all in darkness. Those people are still beating their carpet several years on. I'm glad to say these people have finished doing their business. And now we have some soldiers doing exercises on the lawn. So this one seems to be more about the army than about the navy. The final Canaletto section of the exhibition is about Westminster Bridge, and we've got these 4 wonderful drawings from the Royal Collection. These really deserve to have lots of time spent on them. The first drawing I'm showing you is Westminster Bridge with a view of Lambeth Palace. There's Lambeth Palace. And then we've got, again, the Abbey, St Stephen's Hall, Westminster Palace. Big Ben would kind of be here now, completely dominating the landscape. And this is St John Smith Square, which you could see from the river in those days, also known as Queen Anne's Footstool. Architect was Thomas Archer. What I really love about this picture, though, is how he has made it. And I was lucky enough to look at this with the conservator from the Royal Collection. When you read the labels for these Royal Collection pictures, you'll see that among the techniques it talks about pinpointing. What it means by pinpointing is that he used pins to help him get the right proportions in the drawing. So he used compasses and dividers. And you won't be able to see it with the lighting that we've got now, but with very strong raking light, you can see at this point a little pinpoint here and here and here, here, where he used the compasses to make a lovely round arch. And he was a very precise artist in that way. This is the bridge. We're not sure if it's under construction or if it's being mended. The reason the bridge is so important to Canaletto is it was the thing that actually brought him to London. London is growing. It's spreading westwards. And London Bridge was the only bridge in the London part of the Thames. I don't think there was another bridge until way downstream, almost outside what is Greater London today. So they needed another bridge. Westminster Bridge was completed in 1750. It had 15 arches and it cost £218,000, which was mostly public money, some of which had been raised through state lotteries, which is interesting given that so much of what we do today is money that's been raised through the National Lottery. It's a real wonder of engineering. It was created by a Swiss architect who devised a really clever way of building a bridge. He uses a machine called a caisson or a cassoon to lay the piers. So what that means is that he makes like a huge wooden box and he plants it in the mud. And then he puts his workmen into the box to build the wooden piers so that they're protected by the box from the water. They can work in the dry rather than having to try and lay the stones under the water. He also used a wooden structure. He would make wooden arches, a sort of scaffold, and lay the stone arches on top. That's nothing new. That's always how arches have been built since ancient times. Lots of details, of course. There are some very dangerous people here on the parapet and some dogs having a chat. Look out for the dogs. There's always a dog. A procession of civic barges. This is probably Lord Mayor's Day, and it's a view that would have been very familiar to Canaletto. The shining golden barges on the river, just like back home in Venice with the regattas. And finally this. Isn't this great? The arch, a view through the arch towards the city. There's St Paul's. There's that water tower again. This is one of his most successful images of London. And this is a painting that was made some years earlier for the Duke of Northumberland. The Duke of Northumberland is actually the person who got Canaletto to come to London to record the building of the bridge, because the Duke of Northumberland was the person, well, one of the people who initiated the project. So he was very proud of his bridge. This isn't in the exhibition, by the way. It belongs to the Duke. It's at Syon House. But isn't it clever how he's left this bucket hanging here to point out, in case you hadn't noticed, there's St Paul's again. So that's it for Canaletto. Moving on now to the other artists in the exhibition. We have a section in the Roper Gallery called Canaletto's London Legacy, and it's in the middle of the gallery on yellow walls. The rest of the exhibition is on brown walls. So on the yellow walls you've got things not by Canaletto, like this. This is by Samuel Scott, and I think he's maybe pinched the idea from somewhere. But his London is so different from Canaletto's, whereas Canaletto's is very elegant and very sunny, and he points out all the important buildings. There is not one single important building that you can see here. There's that water tower, there's a kind of a vague church, but otherwise it's sort of wharfs and boats, and not even the boats. The boats are quite scruffy. This one here is carrying some vegetables. There are some people swimming here, probably catching all sorts of hideous diseases, and 2 workmen there taking a break. Samuel Scott was actually already well established when Canaletto turned up in London. He was a very successful maritime painter, a painter of shipping, and one of the interesting facts about him is that he retired to Bath and he died here. He lived in Chatham Row, which is just off Walcott Street. William Marlowe was his pupil, and Marlowe comes after Canaletto. Unlike Scott, he has travelled in Italy, so he's working in a more modern, much brighter style. And here is his view of a very smart new development, the Adelphi. Unlike the buildings we've seen so far, the Adelphi is in a new style, the neoclassical style. It was designed by Robert and James Adam, 2 brothers, hence the name Adelphi, which is Greek for brothers. Still under construction. And again, this British artist, William Marlowe, is concentrating on all the everyday stuff. You can see Westminster Abbey down there, but that's not what interests him. What interests him is the work that's going on. There's the water tower, you see, because you can't manage without that. Stone yard for the construction of this building. There are bricks being made. Here are stacks of bricks. Another stack of bricks there, stacks of wood, and boats being brought up onto the Strand with coal in them. That's kind of what London was really about for most people. It was about work and dirt and commerce. Now, Westminster Bridge turned out not to be enough. So not much more than 10 years later, they had to add another bridge in between Westminster Bridge and London Bridge. This is the Blackfriars Bridge, depicted by Marlowe. Marlowe is very consciously working in the style of Canaletto, because when Canaletto left London, the Duke of Northumberland got Marlowe to make copies of the Canalettos that he owned. And he also got Marlowe to do other paintings, other views of London as well. But again, notice that you can't really see that many important buildings. You can see St Paul's, you can't miss St Paul's. But otherwise, we've got quite a low viewpoint looking at all the everyday things. And this is not a pleasure craft. These people are carrying some sacks of, I'm not quite sure what, but something important. We end with a section that's called Rule Britannia, about British patriotism. British patriotism was really invented in the 18th century, in the mid-18th century, and we look at how British artists and musicians and other people in the arts responded to that. So this is a song which you all know, the celebrated ode called Rule Britannia, and I've highlighted some of the words. I'll go through them in a minute. This was first sung in 1740 at a masque performed for Frederick, Prince of Wales, a masque called Alfred, which was implicitly comparing King Alfred the Great to Frederick, Prince of Wales. This is actually a later edition of the song. Arne's music, with words by James Thompson, were later used for a stage version of Alfred. In 1751 it was brought to the stage at Drury Lane, and the part of Alfred was taken by, guess who? David Garrick. So if you imagine Garrick as Alfred, there's Alfred, he starts the song off. So if you imagine him there in his Saxon garb, singing the song. Alfred the Great, of course, he is from a long, long time before. He's the King of Wessex in the 9th century, so he's not British at all. He was considered to be the founder of the Navy, and this song is really about the power of the British Navy. When Britain first arose from out the azure main, Britain arose from the sea, this island. And then here we have Britannia, rule, not rules, rule the waves. And then we go on to look at, I just picked out some other interesting bits. Thy cities shall with commerce shine. Well, we see that in Canaletto's pictures, don't we? The shining commerce of the city of London. And then this last verse is about the muses and about beauty. So Britain at last is making its mark in the world of the arts. So in the 1740s and 1750s, Alfred becomes the great British hero, even though he's not British in the sense of an ancient Britain, he's actually a Saxon, but never mind the details there. It is actually significant that he's a Saxon because, of course, the Hanoverians are Saxons, so it's not a complete coincidence. So we've just got some prints that show you how popular Alfred was. Here he is in the Isle of Athelney. This is in Somerset Levels where he was hiding out, and 2 knights are bringing him news of a victory over the Danes. The Danes, of course, foreign oppressors, invaders, what the 18th century British are scared of. He also founded University College, Oxford. Did you know that? Alfred the Great apparently was the founder of the University of Oxford in the 9th century, as this picture proves. Here he is handing over a scroll to the great scientists of the ancient world, representing the different strands of learning. And this is just a popular portrait of him. But there's a particular detail to note. Is these? Can you see here these sort of seaweeds and some seashells as well? So he rules the waves, and there's the defeated banner of the Danes with the raven on it. So that's Alfred. The other hero that we look at is from a much longer time back, a genuine Briton, King Bleudad, who founded Bath. Oh, sorry, still looking at Alfred. I just wanted to look beyond what's in the exhibition, because of course we've got Alfred Street in Bath, Alfred House, which for those of you who came to the Wright of Derby exhibition, you'll know that that statue was erected by the radical historian Catherine Macaulay a little bit later on, 1776. But you can see how similar he is to this print, so it may be that that bust is modelled on this print. We've also locally got Alfred's Tower at Stour Head, 3-cornered tower, which was built in honour of Alfred, but it was actually built as a celebration of the end of the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1663. So the defeat of the French was commemorated with this tower in honour of the Saxon King Alfred. It's quite complicated, but I hope it's making sense. Okay, we look more closely at Bath now. These are the Bath worthies, the people who created Georgian Bath. From left to right, who are they? This is Richard Jones, who is the Clerk of Works. This is Ralph Allen, who of course owned some of the land, but more importantly owned the mines that the stone came out of. He is also a very important figure politically. I won't go into that too much. but it's thought that he had quite an important role in the 45, in the overthrow of the Jacobites. This is Mr. Gay, after whom Gay Street is built. So Robert Gay, he owned the manor of Walcott, which was really the area that John Wood built on. And this is John Wood with a ledger under his arm. He is the surveyor who, and the architect who designs and builds the parades, Queen Square, the Royal Crescent, the circus, and so on. He is one of the most important makers of Bath. And he writes a lot about Bath and his theories about Bath. And his theories about Bath are extremely nationalistic, to the point of being completely balmy. And I won't say too much about this now, because there's been a lot published about this recently. You can learn far more about it by visiting the Museum of Bath Architecture, and I'm sure there are lots of people in this room who know more about it than I do, so I'll just whiz through it. This is King Blodad. This is the frontispiece of John Wood's essay towards a description of Bath. So Britain at this time, in the middle of the 18th century, is trying to create its own independent culture, independent of France, independent of Italy, and in particular independent of Rome. So much in European culture at the time is based on ancient Roman models. The British don't like Rome, particularly people who have just finished defeating the Jacobites. They really don't like Rome, because Rome is the centre, is the capital of the Catholic Church. So John Wood is trying to prove that classical architecture has nothing at all to do with ancient Rome. So he writes this essay called The Origin of Building, or the Plagiarism of the Heathens Detected. In other words, the heathens, the ancient Romans, have stolen the classical style. They have stolen classical proportions and the ancient orders. They've stolen it from a much more honourable, probably ancient Hebrew source. He believed that Blodad had travelled from the Avon Valley to Jerusalem. He'd been to Jerusalem and witnessed the building of the Second Temple, which is something which actually happened. It happened in the 6th century BC. From Jerusalem, he travelled to ancient Athens, and he taught the Athenians how to build buildings. He taught them how to build the Parthenon and all the other wonderful things they built. And then the Romans stole their ideas from the ancient Greeks. And then, of course, Blodad came back to Bath and built his own temple here for the Druids. Stonehenge has got, he's numbered them all, there are 30 stones here, 30 houses in Stonehenge, in Circus. They've got all those Druids' acorns around the top. I asked my nephew last year, what are those things on the top? And he said, they're ochre nuts. So now I think of them as ochre nuts. It's also got the same diameter as Stonehenge, 318 feet. So if you'd like to know more about that, as I said, there's plenty in the local library and at the Museum of Bath Architecture. Just a few practical things. Spencer's mentioned some of this. The ticket desk has moved onto the old landing. We've put a bench into the Roper Gallery, and it would be really useful to have your feedback on the location of the bench, because we're not quite sure where it should go. So if you do have any views on that, how people are using it, whether they're comfortable, do let us know. I should mention our sponsors. As ever, we've got Farrow and Ball paint. We've got two shades. One is called London Clay. We used London Clay for the Wright of Derby exhibition as well. And we've used a colour called Sudbury Yellow. It's not named after Sudbury, where Gainsborough lived. It's named after Sudbury Hall in Derbyshire. The main sponsor is our dear old friends Roper Roads, and the secondary sponsor is a marine solicitor very appropriate. They deal with shipwrecks and things like that. Marine solicitor called Tatum McInnes. And I've talked about the book already. So I'm now going to hand over to Louise and Laura, who are just going to say a few things about the Sackler. And that's one of the activities that they've designed there.
Hello. Oh, I don't know how to follow that.
My name is Miss Hampton.
And this is Laura Jones, and we are part of the learning team. And part of our job is to devise activities for the Sackler Discovery Centre. And the Sackler is on the second floor, and it's between the Wright Gallery, the main exhibition gallery, and the Birth. So that's where we are. Hopefully you will be in there, but if you haven't, that's the room we're talking about. And that room is designed specifically as a place for people, young people, children, or anybody really, to have a chance to be creative, to engage with the exhibitions that we have on, and sometimes we have activities there that are based on the collection as well. So whenever we have a new exhibition, Laura and I design activities, creative activities that people can do that will engage them and that might help them want to go and see the exhibition, engage with them, or create something of their own. So that's the idea behind the Sackler. So we just wanted to come and just show you the activities that we've got. We've just been installing today actually, which will form part of the Canaletto experience that we will have. So we're just going to go through 3 activities, and yeah, so this is the first one.
So this board here is one of the 3 boards that you'll see if you go up into the Sackler. I know you're going. Are you taking the group up, or are people allowed to go up later to look at? Following.
No, as soon as we finish, then we'll open the doors and we can go in.
Okay, so following the talk, I believe you're going to go up and look at the fantastic exhibition. But if you'd also like to look at the Sackler, we're still working on it, but I'll have the door open so you can come in and have a chat if you've got any more questions. So each activity has a title that says "Push the Boat Out," and this one. If you've ever been up there before, you'll notice that we often have a vinyl on the window, and kids really love using that as a space to create work and pin their work and using it as a display surface. So it really is impressive this time because we've actually got a vinyl that covers the whole of the window, so it changes the atmosphere of the space and it creates a wonderful light as well, shining through. So the image used for the vinyl is this image here, which is a view of the city from the Somerset House, and our wonderful graphic designers created a beautiful arch at the top there, so you really get a feel of how amazing the Canaletto paintings are, and the atmospheric sky and the wonderful colours that you can see on the river and the boats and the people. So this activity, children can either draw, children or adults, can either draw their own boat, sailor, and add it to the scene, or we've also prepared for slightly smaller children pre-drawn images that they can colour in and add. That's the first one.
And then we also have 15 minutes of play. The idea behind this activity is that there is a blue Canaletto plaque in Soho, Beak Street, where he is supposed to live while he's working in London. So we thought it would be fun for anyone that would like to make their own plaque, his plaque. So the idea is that you Italianise your name by adding an Italian ending, and then you make your own plaque. And we've got to see on up there. We've got a part of a brick wall, and the people can add their own brick plaques to. So that's another activity. And then the third one, this one also, we're trying to encourage people to share their images. So we're asking them to take a selfie next to their plaque and then share it through Twitter and Instagram. So yeah, hopefully we'll get some images back. And then the third activity, the stage is set. This one is looking at the idea of Canaletto starting his career as a kind of set painter with his father, and the idea that he didn't paint exactly what he saw he did, his artistic license, and play around with where buildings were. And so this is an opportunity for people to draw their own buildings, and we're sort of stage set. You'll see when we go up there, where people can add flats and go to build up this wonderful view of a city. We've got images of London, but also images of Bath mixed in. So those three activities are there, and they are free. So really what we would hope and love them to do is, if you see a family or young children or even young people, really anyone, but particularly younger children, to signpost and say, and we do know we have this wonderful space and it's free, go and see, go and use it. If the children want to do some drawing or making, this is the place to go. So either if you at the front desk or upstairs on the desk, just outside the door, just to make people aware of it, because a lot of people just walk past and they don't know. And particularly if they're coming in down here, they don't know it's done.
Yeah, so I'd also like to say, because we've gone through it very briefly today, and you may forget as soon as you leave the room. So when you're on your shift, if you're upstairs outside the exhibition space, on the ticket office, there is a drawer at the top. So in the drawer I will put the 3 activities, so if somebody does ask you, you can do that, and that will help you if you forget. And also, I know some of you work on the front desk, so on the Google Drive, Stephen will be putting these activity sheets. There's also a folder, a Sackler folder, that's green, labelled for Sackler in a drawer, and it will have all the activity sheets should they need replenishing. I'm going to check it. I check it, well, I work full time, so I can check it throughout the week. But I won't be here on the weekends, but duty managers are going to check it on the weekends. If you should notice that anything is missing, any activity sheets are running down, all the pencils bits have disappeared, there's no paper, could you let the duty manager know, and they will inform one of us, one of the team, and we will replenish the activity.
Yeah, the only thing I've got to say is there's also a soundscape in there. So if you hear water noises, Handel's water music coming, that's where it's coming from. And it will be it's on a loop system. There are remote, I think about 10 minutes where it's silent, and then it will just come on again. It's meant to be a background sound. It's quiet, it's ambient.